Here is some of that interview where George Stephanopoulos led the president through a series of questions in which the president said that he was absolutely willing to break the law and accept help from a foreign national or a foreign country in his re-election campaign. Let's listen to this piece of it.
I've seen a lot of things over my life. I don't think in my whole life I've ever called the FBI. In my whole life. You don't call the FBI.
You don't call the FBI. That's what the President of the United States says. The director of the FBI, in testimony just a month ago to Congress, said you absolutely do call the FBI. You must call the FBI in that situation. Joining our discussion now is Sam Stein. He's the politics editor of the Daily Beast. He's also an MSNBC political analyst. Chuck Rosenberg is still with us. Sam, your reading on what this story means for the president tonight.
Well, on the one hand, it's stunning. It's a stunning admission that, in fact, he probably does feel like he needs a foreign government's help for re-election. It's stunning to hear someone utter the words that he did in that position, knowing, of course, that he's in the midst of a 2-plus-year-long investigation into actions directly like this. It's just a sheer, almost political and legal malpractice. And then, on the other hand, it's not stunning at all. This is who Trump is. He views the world in a very binary fashion. Things that are good for him are good, and things that are bad for him are bad. And therefore, if a government wants to help him, then that can't be bad. And so what struck me tonight is not necessarily what this means for Trump, honestly. What struck me tonight is what this means for Democrats. For 2 years before they took over the House, the constant refrain when we heard Trump say things like this was, will the Republican Party ever say anything and stand up to him? And of course, the answer was almost universally no. Well, that changed in January of 2018, 2019, I should say, when the Democrats took over the House. Suddenly, the onus, the responsibility fell on them because they had the power to do something about it. And this is one of those inflection points, and there have been many, but this is a very important one, where no longer do we say, well, Republicans do, we know what they're going to do. It's what will the Democrats do? Will it be enough to just say we're going to look into this? Will it be enough to haul someone before a committee? Or will there be an amplified pressure to begin an impeachment inquiry over comments like this? And, my reading, it's an early reading. My early reading is that the answer is probably no, that this will fall into the ether of traditionally loony Trump comments.
Well, we've got someone to answer that question for you, Sam. We're joined now by Congressman Lloyd Doggett. He's a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, one of the senior members of that committee, Congressman from Texas. Congressman Doggett, to Sam Stein's question, what does this breaking news about the president do to the impeachment momentum in the House of Representatives?
Well, I think it adds more reason for us to move ahead with an impeachment inquiry. The president's comments are astounding. They're alarming. They're a threat to our national security. It's as if we were back in 2016 and he is saying, Russia, if you are listening. Well, tonight he's really saying the same thing not only to Russia but to all our adversaries. He is, for once, telling the truth about what he would do. And I suppose the heads of criminal organizations don't tell the FBI, but we expect more of our president. And so I think Sam is absolutely right. I do find it still astounding that Republican enablers will be silent or will make some excuse for the president. But now we're to June, halfway through this year, and Democrats have yet to go to court to enforce subpoenas requiring anyone to come before the Congress or requiring the production of documents of late. It's time for us to act, to begin this inquiry. And if your member of Congress won't act, then I think the public needs to say why not, and to ask their member to reflect their concern that we have a president who is engaged in one criminal act after another, who always puts himself first and our nation last.
And Congressman, we now have a president tonight who is saying he would violate the law. He is willing to do that. And so I've never seen in the impeachment process, I don't think there has never been in the impeachment process, an issue involving the president's future behavior. You now have it seems possible now to craft an article of impeachment eventually that would say, because the president says that he will do this, he will violate the law in the future, we vote to remove him from office. There's some version of an article of impeachment here that actually has a future tense in it, and I don't think we've ever seen that before.
Lawrence, I think that's right. And of course, we need an impeachment inquiry to perhaps narrow it down a bit, because when you look at all the criminal wrongdoing that is apparent here, it would be an encyclopedic impeachment document. We need to inquire carefully. We begin with a presumption of innocence, but there is so much to suggest that high crimes and misdemeanors have been committed here, and that it is our responsibility to act, and act promptly, instead of continuing to delay and delay. That's the Trump game, is to delay and delay, and we need to not be aiding and abetting it.
Chuck Rosenberg, this is one of those examples of what could have been. In the Robert Mueller interview of Donald Trump, that never happened because Donald Trump refused to submit to that interview. And then eventually Robert Mueller decided not to try to go through the subpoena process with the president, which could easily have taken a year or so. But imagine, if you will, the president is being interviewed by Robert Mueller, and it moves into a territory like this. We saw how easily, with George Stephanopoulos, the president simply went ahead and said what he would do in a future situation, even with the knowledge that he has today.
Yeah, this seems to be a good illustration, Lawrence, of why the president's personal lawyers probably were very much opposed to having him talk to Mr. Mueller and to Mueller's team. The president is a free speaker. He just sort of wanders down paths. He doesn't give much thought to the truth, and he doesn't give much thought to what he's said previously. And so from a criminal defense lawyer perspective, that's perilous. Now, I understand that the Mueller team thought they had most of what they needed, and they were worried about the report taking too long if they had to litigate an issue over a subpoena to the president. But this does illustrate, as you note, why you want to sit down with the subject of the investigation and talk to him. You want to hear in his own words what he was thinking. Today, he told us.
I just want to read for the audience one more time what the law actually says about this. It says, it shall be unlawful for a foreign national directly or indirectly to make a contribution or donation of money or other thing of value, or to make an express or implied promise to make a contribution or donation in connection with a federal, state, or local election. The same law makes it against the law for a person to accept such a thing. And Sam Stein, President Trump said tonight he would accept that. He would violate the accept portion of that law. There's no other moment in our historical record of a president saying that he was willing to commit a crime, willing to violate a law. What law would the president have to announce he's willing to violate for the House to start to take action against him?
I think that's a better question for your other panelists here, the distinguished congressman. What I will say is,
Congressman Doggett is all ready to go to impeachment, so he's not
yeah,
one of the Democrats who's waiting for more.
Then I will say this, and this was mentioned on your previous panel. One of the things that the president and his team pointed to when this was first being litigated after the 2016 election was their lack of familiarity with campaign finance laws and laws in general. And that served them well in that capacity. I believe Mueller referenced that, in fact, with Don Jr. Now they don't have that excuse. They know that the letter of law outlaws this type of behavior. And beyond that, they are living in the political outcome of having engaged in this type of behavior. There's been a 2-year-long scandal and an investigation by several congressional committees and a special counsel's office into this type of flirtation with assistance from a foreign power. So it's mind-boggling, like I said, that he would do it again. But like I said, also, it's almost expected at this juncture. This is who he is. Chuck mentioned that, maybe Trump is someone who will be comfortable saying mistruths. In this case, I happen to think that he was being completely honest. He doesn't see anything ethically wrong with accepting the assistance of a foreign power, and he wonders why other people don't see the world that he does. I will just note there is one historical parallel. We've talked about this before. Al Gore received the stolen George W. Bush campaign debate prep book. They got it in the mail, and the first thing they did when they got it in the mail was alert the FBI. So there is a historical precedent for doing something right in this situation. Trump clearly does not either know the history or doesn't care for it.
And in the interview, George Stephanopoulos made that point, the Al Gore example to President Trump. That didn't slow him down a bit. We have to squeeze in a break here. Congressman Lloyd Doggett, Sam Stein, Chuck Rosenberg, thank you all very much for helping us cover this breaking news. Appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.